Welcome to the Surviving BPD Relationship Breakups podcast with your host, ajmahari. This podcast will give you an in-depth understanding of borderline personality disorder, whether you have it or a loved one, partner, ex, friend, adult child, or sibling of someone with borderline personality disorder. Mahari is a counselor and trauma recovery coach who has 30 years experience working with those surviving borderline personality relationship breakups in all relationship types, healing from codependency, inner child healing, family of origin healing and self-differentiation, narcissistic abuse recovery, and much more. Keeping it real to help you heal. Abuse is not love. You can find this podcast at ajmahari.ca, where you can also purchase and book sessions with ajmahari. Please also subscribe to ajmahari's YouTube channel at youtube.com/ajmahari.
Borderline personality disorder and magical thinking, non-borderlines trying to just understand what BPD magical thinking really is all about. So it's a rather common experience for non-borderlines to encounter and be confused by borderline magical thinking, or many people newer to this may not yet have heard of or know at all about magical thinking in borderline personality. So what is magical thinking in borderline personality disorder? Magical thinking is essentially adhering to the distorted belief or beliefs that thoughts can cause events. When someone with BPD is magically thinking and thoughts seem to cause events, what is also often a part of this experience for the borderline is that what they feel becomes a fact, pseudo-fact, to them, and in what is a distorted sense of objective reality. So it's more reflecting their internal feeling state is what becomes the reality. It is not really what the rest of us would hold in objective reality, in an agreed fashion. So what drives magical thinking of people with BPD? Borderlines often experience their thoughts or beliefs as causing or being related to actual events. This is a misperception of reality. At the heart of magical thinking often is borderline ambivalence, which at its core arises out of the arrested emotional developed self, so that loss of self, out of abandonment trauma, and is played out in repetition and compulsions when people with BPD are triggered. Most often they are triggered in relationships, relationally. And so these repetition compulsions manifest the borderline's engulfment versus annihilation fears, along with fear of abandonment. The borderline fear of being lost to the non-borderline. Non-borderlines are really the container of the borderline's identity. As I've said on my YouTube channel often, they're seeking identity through you in an unconscious way. And so at the same time as, you kind of are holding their identity, unbeknownst to you and unbeknownst to them, borderline fear of being lost to you, in that sense, brings up this fear of abandonment, which would leave the borderline feeling as though he or she doesn't really exist. This is a polarized borderline no-win situation that is often projected out onto others in various different manifestations of conflict and or emotional chaos, or perhaps withdrawal in the case of the quiet borderline. Borderline magical thinking is typical for those with BPD in that it is an example of how those with BPD do not have a grasp on the whole picture of objective reality. And what gets in the way of their grasp of the whole picture is the fact that they don't have a self, untreated. They have this arrested emotional development, so as they get older every year, as they can gain more intellectual knowledge, they are not progressing on an emotional intelligence level. Borderlines, unless and until they get considerable therapy, are very young emotionally. They are not unlike a 2 to 3 year old child would, in an out of sight, out of mind, polarized place, often be, reactionary from. But not every time a borderline is triggered, or, to dysregulated emotion, not every time do they go sort of all the way back or age regress to a 2 or 3 year old. That can happen, but they can just be overwhelmed by whatever the triggered dysregulated emotion is about, and it's always a repetition compulsion experience for them. But people with untreated BPD don't know what that is and don't know what that means. They will externalize it out onto you in a heartbeat, thinking that you're the one that caused it because it's a dissociative experience for them. And that's not excusing anything they do with that behavior or how they aim it at you, try to say you're to blame for it or anything like that. It's just an explanation that I hope will help people. And it's something you can't change, so it's just about understanding it, right? And then making your own decisions from there. So what happened that the borderline couldn't tolerate, so she wanted more space, fearing engulfment, is forgotten as it passes the place that they move into, often in response to their dysregulated, triggered emotions. It does not include the big picture. Borderlines do not fully necessarily forget, but they do not fully remember or hold in their consciousness the want or need for space. Space taken quickly feels like abandonment often, too, to the person with BPD. As soon as a borderline feels even the slightest bit of abandonment, they instantly need the very closeness that will trigger them back to the fear of abandonment or engulfment and the need to push away again. Because these are repetition compulsion cycles that are coming from the unconscious and not so conscious to especially untreated borderlines. When a borderline talks about the future, it's without being connected to the recent past. It's difficult to explain, but arises out of a dissociative protective, out of several protective defense mechanisms. Of course, the major defense mechanism in BPD is splitting. Borderlines live in fragmented pieces of reality, experienced through magical thinking. In the sense of magical thinking, what the borderline thinks in pieces, fragmented bits of reality, is what will cause events to happen in his or her mind. This is what the borderline experiences as parallel to actual reality that others can perceive, but that they have a distortion about. So what the borderline is thinking about the near future, just to him or herself, makes it so. Because they're thinking about it, but more to the point, they end up feeling about it, and that's the other aspect of magical thinking. So whatever they're thinking about the near future, they believe will make it so. So the person with BPD has thought, so it is that thought it, so it is to them. But more to the point, they haven't really thought it, they felt it. So this is how it will be, how they feel. This is how people with BPD perceive anything, if it's in the here and now, or how they perceive based on past, that dissociatively, when they're triggered, comes into their here and now. And the borderline thinking that it will make whatever they're thinking, or more to the point, whatever they're feeling, that it will make it the way that it is, it'll make for reality, in other words, for him or her, until the second that she is triggered again, and then on a dime, in an instant, he or she will revert to the way that he or she acts when triggered, back around the repetition compulsion cycle of re-experiencing engulfment versus annihilation versus abandonment fears, because as the borderline's feelings shift, change, fluctuate massively at times, people with BPD, their, quote, thinking, unquote, shifts, which is really more to the point what they are feeling and often really overwhelmed by and triggered dysregulated emotion. And a lot of this goes on internally. It's not always displayed outwardly, not even by the most petulant or classic acting out borderline. So this is what people on the other side of someone with BPD are missing. You can't know what's driving or motivating the behavior, the conflict, the chaos, and the drama. But still, it doesn't change what you're experiencing with borderline chaos, conflict, jade conversations, and chaos and drama. And the way they're kind of throwing it all on you, because they don't really understand their impact on others, and they also don't really know where all these feelings are coming from inside of them if they're untreated. So they naturally then believe, they think it's you. If you're the closest person to them, they feel like it's you, more to the point, and then that makes it real for them, when it's not really objective reality at all. Borderlines sort of mesh thoughts and feelings together in a way that leaves everything experienced as being everything that is something felt. In other words, they don't even, a lot of the time, they don't even really think about things. So whether a thought is distorted or not, they're not really aware of the thoughts they're having that create the feelings, because a lot of it is about the past, and they don't have conscious awareness of what really wounded them, what their trauma in childhood was about, in the sense of what caused the arrested self, the loss of self. So with people with BPD, thoughts are experienced as feelings, because there's thoughts, and then there's feelings, and then there's action. But they don't get the thoughts, they just feel the feelings. Feelings are fleeting and easily dysregulate people with BPD, extremely overwhelm them. This leads to a lot of behavior and a lot of things that you'll experience as a non-borderline. And maybe you have codependent, most people have codependency as non-borderlines in, these relationships to or with people with BPD, in all relationship types. So it's actually quite normal that non-borderlines cannot reconcile this, quote, borderline cycling, unquote, in their heads, because it doesn't make any logical sense. The borderline is experiencing the fragmented reality that is the experience of magical thinking. More to the point, that what they feel is really real, or that things align in a way of cause and effect, which are not being, that are distorted and not being understood correctly, especially by people with untreated borderline personality. The non-borderline is consciously aware of the big picture. The borderline is not aware of the big picture. The borderline, he or she, is only aware of a few pieces of it at a time, if that, and not that those pieces really connect. And the pieces of the borderline, male or female, their fragmented awareness, keep changing also as his or her mood shift, and as the borderline moves back and forth between dysregulated emotions and calmer times, which would be considered like a base mood. Magical thinking is often present in response to the borderline's fear of intimacy. In his book, Lost in the Mirror, Dr. Richard Moskowitz has an excellent chapter on the reality, so to speak, for borderlines when it comes to intimacy. The reality is that life lived in the borderline land of cognitively distorted and or magical thinking is driven by the constant need to defend from what are triggered repetition compulsions that leave those with borderline personality disorder re-experiencing the horror and terror of very young abandonment trauma or other trauma as well, or the threat of abandonment trauma, dissociatively, so that what they feel and experience that, when they feel and experience that, where they feel and experience it from, more to the point, is from their pasts. It is really felt and re-experienced over and over again as if it's happening in the here and now, which it isn't. And that's the element of dissociation in triggered borderline dysregulated emotion. and a lot of their perception, and the reality they don't have a self from which to trust self or other. They don't understand, untreated, how they impact you. That doesn't excuse what they do. Borderlines do not know how to tolerate the moving in and moving out between healthy intimacy and closeness and healthy distance. They need to be close enough to the non-borderline to feel as if they exist through the non-borderline, but not close enough to the non-borderline to feel as if they are engulfed by the non-borderline and therefore also cease to exist. So really this has all got to do with the false self in BPD. It's got to do with the arrested emotional development before or by the age of 2, and that the person who is otherwise a burgeoning authentic self from infancy to about where the emotional arrest happens, which could be before the age of 2, then they cease to be who they were. The child ego state fragments off and is not known to the person with borderline personality. So that's a big part of what borderline magical thinking is about, but more to the point, it's a huge central core issue in what borderline personality disorder actually is and means, and what drives a lot of what you're going to experience as a non-borderline, likely codependent, when you're in a relationship, any relationship type, to or with somebody with borderline personality disorder. So they do have thoughts, but as is the case for all of us, we have thoughts, then thoughts create feelings, and then thoughts and feelings together create action or inaction. And if we're aware of that, then we can be aware of what we're thinking. We can, parse that, develop that, think about it more, hopefully apply critical thinking, which people with BPD untreated cannot do unless until significantly treated. So thoughts come first, emotions come second, actions come third. This is a tenet and core known reality in humanity from the cognitive behavioral therapy perspective. And so, but people with BPD are not aware of the thoughts that they have that create the feelings. So the feelings seem to come out of nowhere, and then the behavior, the reaction to the feelings, which can be very swift, very much aimed at you, very much blaming you, very much accusing you of all kinds of things, but that really is not accurate, really has nothing to do with you. Non-borderlines who are very codependent take it on like they really believe, you really start to believe that you've done something, wrong, that created whatever the borderline is going on about, the emotions, the anger, the frustration, just likely endless negativity about something or other. So that's just a little bit about, what non-borderlines can hopefully understand more about, how when you are getting blamed and attacked by the person with BPD as if this, that, and the other thing is your fault, and that relational impossibility is generated from them and is, unbeknownst to them, if they're untreated, their responsibility. When they throw it at you, you're trying to understand this borderline behavior, this what did I just do? Why am I to blame? And people lose themselves to these relationships, so people can really start believing what the borderline hurls at you in accusation, projection, and just the externalization out of what they cannot hold because there's no container of self inside to hold. So it's really important to know that borderline magical thinking and the results of it to those who are on the other side of somebody with BPD, close to them, it's not accurate, objective reality what they sling at you. And so what's really important is to try to take that less personally, because a person with BPD in that emotionally triggered, dysregulated place, when they accuse you of this, that, the other thing, and say everything is your fault, and it's because you did this, didn't do that, said that, didn't say this, etc., that you really need to work on not taking that personally, which is very difficult because it's all coming at you But more to the point, it is the borderline talking to you as or yelling at you as object representation of a wounding parent. So they're not even really seeing you or hearing you, but you're there absorbing, perhaps. You need to try to observe and not absorb all the accusations and all the things they're firing at you, that everything that's going wrong right now is your fault. Because nothing could be further from the truth. But this is borderline skewed perceptions with dysregulated, dissociated emotion and abundance of it. And again, I'm not excusing their behavior or how they treat you or what they say to you, but I hope this helps you to understand that you really need to, it would make sense, and you really need to work at not taking their accusations, etc. so personally, because it really isn't even about you. And they don't see you and they don't hear you in these moments or in the jade conversations that justify, argue, defend, and explain, wherein you're the one, as the non-borderline and the codependent, you're the one who's doing the justifying, arguing, defending, and explaining, because the person with BPD does what I call a certain variety, borderline gaslighting, which isn't exactly like narcissistic gaslighting, which maybe I'll talk about in another podcast episode. So I hope that was helpful. Just an attempt to help non-borderlines and who are likely codependent to try to understand more about borderline magical thinking. And the key takeaway for you today should be that you need to start taking what they yell and scream at you, or when they're ignoring you, whatever accusations come flying out at you when they get triggered, emotionally dysregulated, etc. They're yelling and they're blaming and they're accusing the wounding parent as if you are that wounding parent, and you're not. So hopefully what you can take away from this is that you need to start to work on not taking it personally. Doesn't mean a relationship's going to work out, doesn't mean you should stay there and put up with that kind of abuse at all. But the bottom line is, it's not about you. It's not accurate to what you're trying to do in the relationship or who you are. And so you need to work on depersonalizing and detaching from all that borderlines when they're triggered to emotional dysregulation with the magical thinking and the need to externalize out will throw at you, blame you for, and then their intellect can kick into this overly run amok emotional reality for them, where they can pick things that you did recently or you didn't do or whatever their perception is, and this is what makes it feel so personal to you. But they're really not talking to you except for when they, from the intellectual part of self, from the IQ, they start using things like, last Tuesday you did this, a week ago you said that, 6 months ago you said the other, which I will talk more about what does that mean in terms of the idea that a lot of people think that people with BPD don't remember when they're triggered to dysregulated emotion. Because how come they can come back at you for things from 6 years ago, 6 months ago, 2 weeks ago, last Tuesday, and yet there's this claim out there of something called, quote, borderline amnesia, unquote, which really to me seems like a misnomer. And it could vary across people with different severity of borderline personality, but it's unlikely in the majority of cases that they're forgetting very much at all. Maybe sequence of order or something said, but they remember enough about the circumstances to say to you, hey, yeah, but what about, 3 years ago when you said this, or when you didn't say that? So anyway, borderline magical thinking, complicated, again, another driver of behavior that you're going to experience is very traumatizing and hurtful when they vocalize that to you. But remember, it's their externalization, it's what they're going through, it's their lens, they don't really see you, so try not to take this personally. But as I say that, it doesn't mean you should stay in a relationship and keep putting up with this, because abuse is never got anything to do with healthy love. Take care.
You've been listening to the Surviving BPD Relationship Breakups podcast with counselor and trauma recovery coach, Mahari. Keeping it real to help you heal. Abuse is not love. You can find this podcast website with blogs and more information and purchase some book sessions with Mahari at ajmahari.ca to help you with your healing and recovery journey from any relationship type with somebody with borderline personality. Please also check AJ's other website, bpdbreakups.com, for blog posts and more information. AJ's membership site can be found at ajmahari.co. Please keep tuning in, and if you're not subscribed to AJ Mahari's YouTube channel, please check it out at youtube.com/AJMahari.